Hello everybody. Well, since we were unable to finish last week due to my bad time management skills, I decided to put some of the lecture that I was going to do up online, because this theoretical part can be done really by just listening at home, and in any case I'm more interested in some of the experiential stuff for the actual class. So what I was starting on the last day was something that's quite academic, and it wouldn't be something that I know all of you would be interested in. So especially this first section here, I'll just go through it very quickly, because my general idea here is more that you begin to think about the fact that there is an entire history around the theory of social justice. What is justice? What is social justice? And that you begin to think, well, where do I fit into this? And also maybe able to situate yourselves, if you hear names of particular writers and theorists, etc., in the future, that you might think of where you might situate yourself. And most of you at this point in your academic lives, although not all of you, some of you will be a little bit younger in your academic career, but you might be able to I'm sure many of you there will be able to situate yourselves already and understand your own voice. But in any case, I'll carry on with this. So we were looking at section 1 here of today's workshop, and the first section was on social justice theory. So as I was saying to you in the class, we look at this slide here, what is social justice? And we have this, huge kind of bunch of words, and many of us go around and we are, bombarded with these words in some ways, and sometimes we kind of lose track of what we actually really believe in, or where we really stand in relation to this concept of social justice. What is it, and what is your position on it, and what influences you? So you talked a lot about some of your early influences last week. So building on that then, where do you go from here? How do you put a theory on this? How do you put a framework around it to help you understand? And that's very often what academic life is about. It's about putting practice and theory, and particularly in this field that we're looking at here, which is development education. It's all about the practice and the theory. Both the practice and the theory are important in their own ways. So what we're going to look at just here now again is the history of the concept of social justice, which is quite complicated. It's a huge journey of over 2,000 years. So the journey of a concept. As I said to you, in the early days, around 469 BC to be precise, Plato and Aristotle and Socrates, these guys, they were talking about the idea of justice. Plato talked about justice, but he talked about it as promoting harmony and structure in the individual, and by extension, the community. Private property should be held by the state, ruled by philosopher kings who would be acknowledged about how to promote justice. So, it was a very completely different idea than what we have. When we hear the word justice today, it means something completely different than what Plato was talking about, which was more of an individual and a community harmony. And in addition, he was very much into, class structures. So it was really more about harmony for the rich, really, and for than the population as a whole. Likewise, Aristotle, talked about justice, and he was the first person to talk about distributive justice, that goods and assets should be given to people according to their merit. But of course, again, it was only some people. It was the people who were in the patrician and not the plebiscite classes. So in other words, the rich. In the Middle Ages, St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas recognized the distinction between human law and divine law. Natural law, according to them, is God's law made known to man through his reason. Augustine and Aquinas took a prescriptive approach instead, meaning that in their view, natural law involves the unchanging fixed rules that continue throughout time. In other words, it was a fixed idea of what justice is, and that it wouldn't change over time. Okay, and they made a distinction between natural law and God's law. This is not something you really need to fully understand, but just maybe I'm really only doing it to just give you the sense of the long history and tradition behind this idea, and all the thousands of years of writing that have happened around the idea of justice. So modern concepts then of social justice really revolve, in terms of mainstream theories, the liberal tradition in political theory. In mainstream theories, the idea of the social contract is the key thing to remember. Okay, so right back to particularly to Thomas Hobbes in the 17th century, and many other writers that some of you will have heard of, right up to the present day, this idea of a social contract is very important in the whole area of social justice. It's this imagined social contract between, I suppose, the person or the citizen and the state. Okay, so Thomas Hobbes was the first person who talked about this in the 17th century. So, like, I suppose what he's talking about there is that man has opted to live in a lawful society because it is a better method of self-preservation than every man for himself. And other people and names that some of you might have heard of are Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Kant. All of these people will be names that you will come across at some point in your academic career. And basically, they're all coming from the social contract kind of notion. They all differed quite radically from one another, but they're in that tradition of social contract. So it's grounded in the idea that naturally free and equal human beings have no right to exercise power over one another, except in accordance with the principle of mutual consent, a liberal tradition in political theory. Okay, so social justice as a term was coined by a Jesuit priest called Luigi Tapparelli in the 1840s. And again, it goes back to the Aquinas tradition. So there's a whole tradition there that goes right back. But a very, very important name in this whole area of justice, social justice, is John Rawls, who talked about, again, a liberal tradition, and he is the author of A Theory of Justice, 1971. So he died just in 2002. Okay, so he's quite recent, and he's a very significant philosopher. And I suppose, again, it's just to give you the sense of the background and the weight of thinking that's gone behind us, I suppose, as people who are thinking about these things. He talked about a veil of ignorance. And behind the veil of ignorance, we assume hypothetically that we do not know anything about our possible position within the society for which we are developing laws. We would be guided by the principles of justice and fairness if we didn't know. So to give you an example, his idea would be that it's a thought experiment. It's an experiment of your imagination, and you're to imagine that you are representing. For example, if you go to a desert island, is a good example of what he was talking about, and if you imagine that you're representing other people who are going to come and live on this island. Okay, and now it's not like you're going to a desert island and you are arriving there yourself and you're going to see what happens. This is more something you have to imagine, and it's something that you have to think about really. What would guide you if you were there to represent other people and you don't know absolutely anything at all about these people? You know nothing about them. You don't know who they are. You don't know whether they're men or women, whether they're able or disabled. You don't know whether they are, gay or lesbian, or you don't know anything about them. So what he's saying is that in those circumstances, behind this veil of ignorance, in other words, ignorance about the people that you are representing, if we were thinking about society from that perspective, we would be guided by the principles of justice and fairness. Okay, so what he's talking about here, this concept of the original position. right? That's the original position is what I just described. It's a hypothetical device for developing and examining the justice of societal principles and laws. Okay, so behind the veil of ignorance, we must assume we do not know whether we will be rich or poor, male or female, young or old, criminal or victim, black or white, within the state we are organising and under the law we are proposing. Our guiding principle, as I said, is justice as fairness. So guiding principle number 1, equal liberty. Each person is to have an equal right to the most extensive basic liberty compatible with similar liberty for others. This principle guarantees as much liberty as possible to individuals. As long as my freedoms do not hinder the fundamental liberation of others, I should be free to act as I choose. Is there a second? Okay, sorry. Distracted by somebody who came is another way that one could look at social justice, and completely different than the kind of social contract idea that we've been listening to. Another very strong tradition in terms of social justice theory are faith-based traditions. You could look at probably every faith in the available, Hindu, Buddhism, everything, and you will see that there is a tradition in all of them of theories of social justice. So, like for instance, Islam talks about the 5 pillars. As you know, the 5 pillars in Islam includes zakat or alms giving. So things like volunteering and social activism are talked about in Islam. Areas of communities needing assistance must get attention, and not just your own personal wants being looked after. Many of you in this country will be more familiar possibly with Catholic social teaching, which is concerned for the poorest and most vulnerable members of society. Life and dignity of the human person. The foundational principle of all Catholic social teaching is the sanctity of all human life and the inherent dignity of every human person, from conception to natural death. Human life must be valued above all material possessions. And obviously that teaching is actually very controversial in this country, particularly in relation to the whole issue of abortion. But that would be considered to come under, theories of social justice within the Catholic tradition. And then as well, the Catholic tradition talks about the preferential option for the poor and vulnerable. Catholics believe Jesus taught that on the day of judgment, God will ask what each person did to help the poor and needy. Amen, I say to you, whatever you did for one of these least brothers of mine, you did for me. So there may be people within the class here who are actually, more influenced by their faith tradition, and I'm conscious that one or two of you are very influenced by your faith tradition. And again, it's important to be able to hold that place. If that's where you're coming from, then you need to be able to, stand in that place and maybe have a more, and over time develop a more kind of sophisticated idea of what that really means, and be able to kind of argue back, in terms of, so if you wanted to kind of continue on and in that tradition and read more about it, again, you could look into that further. Another one, and I think, I suppose I have to say that I probably was influenced by the Catholic Church, because in terms of social justice, because of the environment in which I grew up, which was a very Catholic time in Ireland, and I suppose particularly later on in my 20s, I would have been influenced very strongly by liberation theology, which is a theology that developed particularly in South America. Around social justice, and it has strong roots in the Catholic Church. So I have to say that I was influenced by the Catholic Church in my development around social issues, although it wouldn't be strongly where I would be coming from at this point, but I do believe that it has influenced me. Possibly more so, I have been influenced by more feminist traditions. So another set of traditions around social justice is feminist writings. Now, there was one writer in the 1700s, coming into it was the late 1700s, called Mary Wollstonecraft. And this is writer that I've been hearing a lot more of in recent times that I hadn't heard about until recently. And I'm very interested in looking at her a little bit more than hadn't really come across her other than just her name. But I realised that she was one of these many women in in history that had just as good and as if not more so, profound thinking in a very revolutionary way for her time. And of course, because of her being a woman in the first place, probably didn't get as much attention as some of her male counterparts. So I'm very interested in reading more on A Vindication of the Rights of Women, written in 1792. So women should be treated with equal dignity and respect as men, especially regarding education. She particularly focuses on education, and that's so important. There are many women in the world today, and many girls, who still don't get the same kinds of opportunities as boys do. So her writings in 1792 could be just as relevant today. She was also influenced by the French Revolution. The democratic mood of class equality in France seemed to overlook gender equality, which inspired her to speak out for the equality of the sexes. So that's an interesting tradition there. And my understanding is that, while I wouldn't be an expert on social justice theory per se at the moment, my understanding is that she would be really considered I suppose the grandmother of feminist writings in this area. So a very influential, and I think a writer who's getting a lot more kind of attention in recent times, and it will be interesting to hear more and read more about her. More recently, a very well-known writer from particularly her 1989 book, Susan Moeller Oken. Her book is called Injustice, Gender and the Family. Her book is called Justice, Gender and the Family. And she talks about the relationship between gender and justice. So I suppose for her, what happens in the family is very central to her understanding of justice. The private sphere of the family educates youth about justice and also influences society as a whole. This view that personal relationships involve power just as much as any governmental system is sometimes summed up by the phrase, the personal is political. Now again, this whole idea of the kind of private sphere is something that Oken brings into this discussion, which is again completely different than the kind of social contract tradition that we were hearing about earlier. So this entire so I suppose the whole feminist teachings and feminist writings in this whole area form what I would call another huge and important tradition, and one which I feel personally have been strongly influenced by. And some of you talked in the class previously, so from the 60s and 70s and up to the present day, the intersectionality theories. So it's the study of overlapping or intersecting social identities and related systems of oppression, domination or discrimination. And I think many of you in the class, from my understanding anyway of you, is that you probably have been very influenced as well by what quite simply is the intersection between different theories. Since the 60s, into the 70s, 80s, 90s, there's been an awful lot of other ways of looking and understanding and interpreting and framing social justice. So we have different lenses. We're now looking from a gender perspective, from a race perspective, from a class perspective, from ability, disability, sexual orientation, religion, caste, age, and all these other ways of looking at the lenses that we can now look at, or we look at social justice. And for many, there's, I suppose, while there's a lot of differences in those contexts and within those frameworks, there is a kind of a theory which is called intersectionality theory, where it's about how these various biological, social and cultural categories can be used as a framework for understanding how systemic injustice and social inequalities occur on a multidimensional basis. So the classical conceptualizations of oppression within society, such as racism, sexism, classism, ableism, biphobia, homophobia, transphobia, and belief-based bigotry, do not act independently of each other. Instead, and this is the important part, these forms of oppression interrelate, creating a system of oppression that reflects the intersection of multiple forms of discrimination. Another area of social justice theory is utilitarianism. Again, another tradition, which is the belief that the best action is the one that increases pleasure for the greatest number of people. For example, philosophers, and again, some of you might have heard of these names: Epicurus, Bentham, John Stuart Mill. So they believe that human beings are governed by pain and pleasure and aim to calculate how to achieve the most good for the most people. Now, we're not too far away in neoliberalism from this whole idea of pleasure, so it's interesting to look at utilitarianism, but it is again another whole tradition of social theory. So some definitions then of social justice. I'll put some of these definitions up onto our course page, and you can take a look at them. It might be easier to just look at some of those theories and see which ones you feel drawn to, or where do you think your own influences have come from. So even if you could have some idea of I think I've been very influenced by the theory around class, or theories around feminism, or theories from my faith, or theoretical constructions from the whole area of black identity, for example, or from ethnic identity. So interesting to think about where you think you stand, or you may be influenced by all of these, in which case you may feel drawn to the whole idea of theories of intersectionality. But in any case, I would urge you to just have a think about that, and I would really appreciate if you could, as an activity in the class, use the definitions given that I'm putting up on the webpage, and in the forum, try to come as a class to a definition of what for this class social justice is. I really am not expecting high or I don't even need high level theoretical frameworks here. I'd really like in your own words, as a group of people, what you think social justice is as we go forward in this class, which is about social justice. So it's really important that we come together, including myself, and talk about what we mean by social justice. So that's the activity for this week for the class. Thank you very much for listening.